Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here today. You are joining us for our first ever conversation in the McKnight Fiber Art discussion series, and this is part of the McKnight Fellowships for Fiber Artists. This is our inaugural year of this special program that is funded by the McKnight Foundation. Before I get into any more introductions, I just want to let everyone know that the second discussion of this series will take place on Monday, March 8th at 6 p.m. Central Time with Karen Patterson, who is the curator at the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia. Watch your email and our website in the next week for the registration link to that Zoom session. Founded on the belief that Minnesota thrives when its artists thrive, the McKnight Foundation's arts program is one of the oldest and largest of its kind in the country. Support for individual working Minnesota artists has been a cornerstone of the program since it began in 1982. The McKnight Artist Fellowships program provides annual unrestricted cash awards to outstanding mid-career Minnesota artists in 14 different creative disciplines. Program partner organizations administer the fellowships and structure them to respond to the unique challenges of different disciplines. Currently, the foundation contributes about $2.8 million per year to its statewide fellowships. For more information, you can visit the mcknight.org/artist fellowships website. We'll put that in the chat. Thank you again for being here. This Friday, we're on Friday. It's the last day of what we have been billing as Fiber Art for All Week. It's been a series of programs that celebrate a whole variety of things in the fiber arts. For those who are joining us for the first time, Textile Center is a national nonprofit center for fiber art located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In addition to this packed lineup of artist talks and classes, Fiber Art from A to Z is an auction which is serving as the centerpiece of the work, and you can see the web link on your screen to the events of the week. I'm going to go ahead now and introduce the two inaugural fellows in the McKnight Fellowship Program for Fiber Artists and our host, moderator, I'm not sure what we call him, our discussant this week, Glenn Adamson. We're going to begin with each of the fellows making a presentation, followed by a presentation from Glenn and a conversation, and then we will be taking questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question that we can address towards the end of the conversation, we will ask you to put your questions in the chat room, and the hosts of the event will be moderating the questions. So we're going to start out with Liz Miller. Liz's work has been featured in solo and group exhibitions throughout the U.S. and abroad. Past awards include a Joan Mitchell Foundation Partners and Painters and Sculptors Grant, a McKnight Foundation Fellowship for Visual Artists, a Jerome Foundation Fellowship, and several Artist Initiative grants from the Minnesota State Arts Board. Miller has participated in artist residencies at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans and the McCall Center for Art and Innovation in Charlotte, North Carolina. She lives and works in Good Thunder, Minnesota, and is a profession of installation art and drawing at Minnesota State University, Mankato. Our next presenter and fellow will be Eun-Kyung Suh, Korean-born textile installation artist. Eun-Kyung Suh received her MFA from the University of Iowa in Iowa City. Since 2008, she's focused on a series of sculptural vessels as metaphor for personal, family, and cultural memories. These vessels are created out of diaphanous textiles, originally inspired by bojagi, a traditional Korean art form. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and was published in Textiles, The Art of Mankind, Thames and Hudson, Surface Design Journal, Metalsmith, and others. Currently, she is a professor in the Department of Art and Design at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And finally, our discussant and guest critic today is Glenn Adamson. I'm thrilled to have Glenn join us for this inaugural conversation. So thankful. Thank you, Glenn. Glenn is a curator, writer, and historian who works at the intersection of craft, design, and contemporary art. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City, head of research at the V&A, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Adamson's publications include Thinking Through Craft from 2007, The Craft Reader 2010, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion 2011, co-edited with Jane Pavitt, The Invention of Craft 2013, and Art in the Making 2016, co-authored with Julia Bryan Wilson. He's also recently published Fewer and Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects 2018, and has a new book forthcoming, Craft and American History, which will be published by Bloomsbury in January of 2021. And I'm not sure if that came out yet, but I think you'll update us. And welcome to the fellows and to Glenn. And we're going to start off with a presentation by Liz Miller.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm going to go into a screen share here. Okay. I'm really excited to be part of this. I want to take a few minutes, just briefly, to say thank you to the McKnight Foundation for making all of this possible, to Textile Center of Minnesota, specifically to Tracy Crum, who I'm going to miss so much when I don't get these wonderful texts and emails from her. She's just been phenomenal. To Eun-Kyung Suh, who has been just amazing to work with and whose work I admire so much, and I'm so grateful to be sharing the gallery with, and to Glenn Adamson, who I am just really thrilled is joining us today and whose work I've admired a long time. At the start of 2020, I had taken a bit of a respite from my installation practice, and I was deeply engaged in creating wall-based works like the one you see here, comprised of rope. And for a long time, my work has been engaged in issues of infrastructure and collapse of infrastructure. And rope seemed to me to be a material that carried so many different connotations, from the decorative to the deadly, and that was also both so structural and malleable at the same time. And so at the time I got the fellowship, I was really sort of focused away from my installation practice and focused on wall-based rope works like the one that you see here. And I really had no idea how infrastructure would truly collapse in 2020, at the time that I began making these works that I discussed in relation to infrastructure. As the world shifted in 2020, I sort of felt my sensibility shifting, and the wall seemed like somewhere that I didn't want to be. I was having trouble sort of like focusing my attention on one thing, and I bet that many people can probably relate to that. And so I really started to create small gestures in the studio that I didn't know exactly how they would feed into something larger. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but I was sort of creating installation components once again. And so I think that in a sense, 2020, the uncertainty and the chaos led me back away from the wall and back towards my installation practice. I never really expected to create my McKnight installation from materials like gutter guards. That was something that I didn't plan on, but I think that there were so many things about 2020 that I didn't plan on. And I certainly couldn't have known when I received the award in January what the year would bring. As the events of 2020 continued to unfold and things became more and more uncertain, I became more and more sort of stuck in a geography that I've inhabited for some time now. So as Tracy mentioned, I teach installation art and drawing at Minnesota State University, and I live in a really small town of about 550 people. It's called Good Thunder, Minnesota, and the surrounding landscape is really a rural landscape. And I think that my place in that landscape had always been really kind of predicated on my ability to leave the landscape. So it was a place that was almost to me kind of like my getaway, but I was always able to go to a city or sort of experience a bigger place. And I think that 2020 and the pandemic and social isolation forced me to kind of reckon with the landscape in a really specific way. I mean, I was literally kind of stuck in it. And so it forced me to kind of be part of that landscape in a way that I think that I hadn't, even though I've lived there for a long time. So to be honest, I've always had like a somewhat uncomfortable relationship with the rural environment. And again, I think that this year forced me to sort of explore that and to study it. I've enjoyed the natural beauty of the landscape that I live in for over a decade. And I've experienced the subtle and not so subtle tensions, I think, of the place I live. And I felt those tensions kind of heightening at the same time that I was stuck in this place. So as sort of, the pandemic unfolded and social unrest unfolded, I think I felt more and more uncomfortable where I lived, but also more and more like I needed to find a way to kind of embrace the space and explore it. And so my husband and I bought gravel bikes and we started really cycling through the countryside and exploring these sort of paths that we previously had never really explored. And so I think that my experience of the landscape became a really different experience than when I was able to kind of easily leave. And I started to approach it from a kind of critical lens and a lens of both sort of engagement and estrangement, I think. I was deeply engaged and part of this community and part of this landscape. But also felt like a sense of distancing from it. And I was interested in both of those qualities. To be clear, at the time, I did not consider riding my bike a part of my artistic practice. I think I was just kind of doing it to not go insane during the pandemic. But as I cycled more and more miles, I started to notice these sort of shared ad hoc aesthetics and ways of making things that just fascinated me as someone with no previous sort of background in fibers and textiles and who came to those materials in a very like organic and process oriented way. I sort of saw people doing in the landscape what I was doing in my studio. And so these are just some images of snow fencing, but like the image, the detail image where the person is sort of taking zip ties and filling in the structure of the fence with zip ties. These were sort of like these improvised ways of making that I felt like a real resonance with because I was already doing those things in my studio. I also became fascinated at the sort of ways that people were creating demarcations of space and how those divisions of space were so sort of permeable. So using these really porous sort of sieve-like materials to create these, fences and boundaries that weren't really fences and boundaries that would keep anything or anyone in or out. And I felt the need to be both visible in that landscape and to kind of disappear into it. And there were several moments where I saw like hunters drive by with trucks full of materials to create like blinds in the landscape. And it almost looked like its own form of installation art. And so for all my sort of discomfort in the landscape, there was also kind of like this shared aesthetic and material sensibility that really excited me. So when 2020 started, even though I had been really determined like not to make work about the place I live and not to make work about the pandemic, I didn't want to make pandemic art, but I think I ended up really doing both through the lens of abstraction. I felt like I wanted to make a kind of fort that was both an escape from reality of the place that I was in, but also a celebration of it. And I think it was really important to me that I was approaching this from a point of view where I wasn't making fun of the place. Like I was really, in a genuine way, I think, trying to find connection with this place and to research this place. So the idea of visibility and invisibility was really interesting to me. The idea of the sort of porousness and openness of the materials, and the idea of creating in the gallery at Textile Center, a space where you could both be hidden within the work and also visible, a space that you could walk through, but that also had points where maybe you felt like you were a little bit sort of trapped. And so this is the work that I created. It's entitled Blind for 2020. And I really wanted to sort of entice the viewer through these layers of texture and materiality. And again, this kind of ad hoc, improvised sense of making that I think I come to somewhat naturally, and that, you know, was also reflected in the environment around me. But I also wanted to create something that hopefully would engage in some rigorous questioning of place and space, and a deeper investigation into boundaries and geographies and the ways that we carve out identities within those spaces. And so all of that is kind of wrapped up in this investigation, which for me, in one sense, of course, is very formal, very tactile, full of color. But I have to say that those are also things I saw reflected in the rural landscape, which I think people often, you know, think of as this kind of desolate place. But I sort of like started to see it in a really different way. And so this is the final image I'll show. And I consider this work kind of a fantasy and a reality. It's materially assertive, but it's an illusion that viewers can walk through, become enveloped in, and hopefully ultimately inhabit. So thank you very much. I am going to stop screen sharing so that Eun-Kyung can screen share.
Maybe can you make sure my screen is correct?
It looks great.
Okay. Thank you so much for everyone being here this afternoon. It was early January 2020. I received an email from Tracy saying I was selected for the McKnight Fellowship Fiber Art. I kind of screamed without screaming. So it was such an honor to receive this fellowship. And then the opportunity that McKnight program has provided me was such a blessing. Unfortunately, I was not able to take a full advantage of all the opportunities due to the pandemic. But yeah, it was really a blessing experience. So I'm not gonna spend time to thank everyone who helped me come this far because I have very limited time, only 10 minutes. So I will have another chance to show my appreciation to people who helped me greatly for last year. So I've been thinking about how to start my presentation. And then after long kind of contemplating, I finally decided to start my cursor. So finally, I decided to start my presentation by showing my very first textile installation in 2008. The work was about my personal story. Each box illustrating my photographic diary in 1987 when I was going through social and political unrest in South Korea, where I came from. Since then, I've been investigating diaspora experiences of groups such as Korean immigrants, transracial adoptees, and comfort women, the sex slaves during World War II. For the McKnight Fellowship exhibition, I came back to expressing my personal experience again. The new work you can see at the Textile Center is truly the 2020 version of my personal diary again. So for this exhibition, I created two pieces. One, falling lows, suspending white silk panels, and another work, shelter, made out of cardboard, which started behind the door in Mary Guy's gallery. When I received the McKnight Fellowship, frankly, I didn't really have new, fresh, or big ideas or a project for the exhibition. So instead, I reinterpreted my ongoing project, which I started 2019, which involved collecting discarded fabrics from garage, moving, or estate sales in small towns beyond the metro area in Minnesota. So these are small cities and towns where I gathered second-hand domestic fabrics, and then I embedded them inside hexagonal vessel forms. So this is a view outside the gallery. The number of garage or moving sales was a lot smaller in 2020 compared to year 2019. But by visiting small cities and towns, I was able to see how people manage to sustain their lives at the challenging times. Loss of employment and housing, reduction in income, inability to pay their bills in full, and so many other problems. But I was truly amazed by the way people went through their worst hardship in their lives. So I installed the vessel forms at the Textile Center to reflect the way people manage their stress, anger, anxiety, and burden of their life. These vessel forms are aggressively spread across the walls, laboriously crawl over the fence, and persistently overcome barriers. As we didn't stop progressing and moving forward during difficult times last year. And these vessel forms didn't stop spreading or growing, whether the space is noble or humble. The entire shelter pieces are clustered and scattered in the textile space. As the rapid spread of coronavirus proved that we are all connected, but we needed to be disconnected to each other to survive. Last year, I, maybe like many of you, had a deep urge to cut everything and then get back to the bare essentials. Maybe another change, checking the COVID-related news and data became my very routine, as we used to check the weather daily. So falling lows, I keep track of the numbers of deaths each county in Minnesota and use the death toll from March 21st when the first death of Minnesota resident was confirmed. And then this is a table of total deaths in Minnesota and numbers in each county from March through October 31st. Obviously, this country has failed to protect us. And now we lost nearly 500,000 people our family members, and our community members. In general, we accept the death as an unavoidable part of our life cycle. No one can avoid it. But the death on this mass scale we witnessed last year was beyond my understanding why this is happening. At first, I was extremely shocked and fearful. But soon I was getting a little bit tired, kind of listening to news and watching TV. And gradually I had become numb and dull to this tragedy as a result of a near daily exposure to this unspeakable outbreak. So this is the view of the underside of falling logs. So multi-layered silk panels suspended from ceiling, revealing the laser cut shapes. The laser cutout on the silk panels came from the map of each county, centering funeral homes. And this is a map representing Martin County. And then this is a portion of Ramsey County and Hennepin County. The number of cutouts symbolizes the number of deaths from each county from March until October. And I titled this work as Falling Logs, as a death has come to our community with an unexpected speed and scale, like a rain. So I placed a pile of cutouts from the silk panels on the floor, and I collected the names from obituary and removed their last name not to identify the entities of the dead. The names are projected from the ceiling mounted projector with a waxing and waning effect to illustrate the floating and ephemeral quality. And let me show you the video. The sound that you are hearing is what I collected while I'm working on silk panels with a laser cutter. Last year has awakened me a fact that we all die. I have known it to be true in a sense, but the pandemic made me internalize this understanding. I used to think death is located at the end of my life, but now I see that death is near me and I might need to fold the death into my life. Sadly, this was a forced awakening. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, and I think that's my cue to go next. I'll be the last presenter. So again, my name is Glenn Adamson. If you're joining late, I'm not an artist. I'm just joining as a commentator, and I've had the great privilege to be involved in the McKnight Fellowship program, and have in fact been able to connect with both of these very fine artists, with Liz and Suh, over the course of their fellowship at a couple of stages. And it's been really exciting to see the work grow and develop and then finally land in these exhibition installation photographs that you've been seeing. I too have a few images to show. So let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen. These are just going to be, let's see here. Okay, you can see that. Just a few comparisons to make, and I'll just limit myself to a handful, although there's certainly many, many others I could have brought to the juxtaposition of these two bodies of work that you've been looking at. First, I just wanted to start by giving you an image of these so-called Boro Textiles from Japan, which are among many international traditions of used, reused scraps of fabric. You might also be aware of the quilts of the Southern American tradition, particularly African American tradition, like the quilts of Gee's Bend, which have been so celebrated. And what I think is very interesting about them, particularly in relationship to contemporary art practice, for reasons I'll get into in a moment, is that they represent an intersection of the found and the made. So each of these textiles will have been produced in another context, often a mass-produced context, sometimes, of course, a context very far away from where the maker of this completed collage or patchwork textile might be based. So you have this very interesting intersection between craft and machine production, between the local and the potentially global. And also, of course, a kind of palimpsest or overlay of different temporalities, because each of these textiles will have a different age, and then we'll have the additional markings of wear upon it, particularly because these textiles are often produced in context of relative material deprivation, which is important to know when celebrating their aesthetic qualities, because it's a little easy to fall into the attitude of, just revering their beauty and sort of forgetting the fact that they bespeak a quite difficult life on the part of their maker. Also very much true of the early Gee's Bend quilts, certainly. So although these are not really in any way intended as artworks, at least not in the context of gallery or museum display, and were typically very much thought of as having a functional purpose, they actually incorporate a lot of features that, as I'll show you in a moment, are right at the core of the way that textile materials have been used in contemporary art practice. And when I say contemporary, I guess I mean the past 50, 60 years. Contemporary seems to get longer and longer all the time because we don't seem to be coming up with another word for it. But certainly for me, the history of the or the very possibility of the use of textiles as a creative and explicitly modernist discipline really originates in figures like Lenore Tawney. And I'm introducing her here in kind of pole position, partly because I actually worked with Karen Patterson, who is going to be the next speaker in this fixture, and in dialogue with Suh and Liz. I worked with Karen on a big project at the Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, that focused explicitly on the work of this artist, Lenore Tawney. The book is called Mirror of the Universe. If you're interested, there's a lot to read there and some beautiful photography as well. Some of that beautiful photography, of course, from the period, like the image from 1962 that you're seeing on the left of Tawney seeming to play an open gauze weaving that she had made almost as if she were playing a harp. A very interesting and captivating image. On the right, you're seeing one of her later cloud pieces. In fact, very late, this is really her last body of work. And what you can see over the course of her career is an almost a dematerialization and a rethinking of textile techniques so thorough that it almost stopped being textile at all. So the way that she made the clouds was simply to individually knot strands of linen to a kind of ceiling of, in this case, found textile, creating this sort of shower or ethereal atmosphere out of these single hanging yarns. So they're not actually woven together. So in a sense, it's not really a textile at all. It's more like material that's being presented to you. But also notice how she used a very slight coloration in the interior to create this sort of hovering form in the center of the object, very spiritual, very much influenced by her interest in meditation. So as you can tell, a lot to know and to say about this artist, but the fundamental point is that she was going from historically informed textile practice, in the case of the gauze weaving on the left, for example, drawing very much on ancient Peruvian precedents, into something that was much more open, both literally and also metaphorically and artistically. And her intervention into textile history, as well as that of other artists of her generation or a little bit younger, like Sheila Hicks, who's often been related to her, and has an equally powerful, although very different, much more kind of muscular and assertive sculptural abstract practice. This generation coming to textiles in the 1950s and 60s, eventually culminating in what came to be known as the fiber art movement, really just totally changed the situation, opening the domain of fine art practice to these materials, and also I think to particular subjectivities. Needless to say, I'm sure nobody here needs to be told this, but textiles has often been very much associated with female practitioners, specifically often with non-white, non-European or American practitioners. And so it draws on a series of trajectories and traditions that had really been occluded from the fine art world. I notice there's a fascinating graphic design phenomenon happening on the top of this image. I have absolutely no idea how that's happening, but I think Sheila Hicks would probably have loved it. But I just changed the image. Oh, it's still there. That's funny. I don't know what's going on there, guys. But some kind of bizarre Zoom artifact. But at any rate, I feel like somebody's drawing in crayon on physically on my screen. Does everyone else feel like that too? It's quite uncanny, but weirdly appropriate for the subject at hand. Anyway, looking at the history from another angle, of course, you have people who think of themselves in no way as fiber artists or textile artists, but are working with textile materiality as part of an open or expanded repertoire of sculpture, of whom, of course, Eva Hesse is the central example, perhaps in the late 1960s, really emphasizing process, contingency, the intuitive and subjective, instinctive experience of the studio. And in fact, this is a shot in her studio, as a way of thinking about the making of the work. Also very much thinking about imagery of the body, which is something that often we see in craft-related work as well. And then crucially thinking about, as I've been saying before, the relationship between the made and the found, because she's often working with existing objects like, as you can see here, tires or netting or plastic, as well as industrial materials, some of which unfortunately helped to make her ill and contributed to her early death, very tragically. But really thinking of the work as a meeting place in which these two types of materiality combine. The materiality that is under the control of the artist entirely and comes from the artist's hands from scratch, as it were, and then materiality that's imported from outside and bespeaks the complex worlds of production in which we all sit, not just artists among us. For me, a great and important figure that stands within this tradition is Jessica Stockholder. And Liz and I had some fond conversations about Jessica Stockholder. She's an artist that's not nearly as well known or as respected as she probably ought to be. I mean, she's super respected, especially by other sculptors and other artists. But she probably is the most influential American sculptor of the 1990s. But that influence has often traveled in a kind of subterranean way. And I dare say gender has something to do with it. Oh yeah, sorry.
Hey Glenn,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think there might be something like a drawing thing that has been activated. So
yes.
I think if you wouldn't mind stopping your screen share and restarting it, I think that might fix our problem. I'm sorry to our participants about that.
Great. You can see the Jessica Stockholder a lot better. Thank you very much for that advice. Although I slightly mourn the disappearance of that arbitrary set of marks. It's very memorable in a way. No two Zoom sessions are alike, right, guys? Okay, so Jessica Stockholder, here, obviously not particularly using textile except for the single band that's a kind of shipping strap that, tightens itself, almost like a belt tightening around trousers in the middle of this work. which, as you can see, also includes a school desk and some plastic and some metal mesh, not that dissimilar actually from some of the things that Liz has been working with. And again, the composition is very open, very exploratory, very painterly, we could say, even though it's a sculpture, really thinking about the adventitious or opportunistic possibilities that found materials offer in terms of color, in terms of texture, as well as in terms of association. And, you know, as Liz said in her remarks, once you've seen work like this, walking down the street is different, because when you pass a construction site, it might well look to you like a scatter artwork from the 1970s, or in fact, like a Jessica Stockholder. So this is also this very interesting way that work in this direction actually reverses the polarity of, let's say, Marcel Duchamp's famous strategy of the ready-made, bringing in the artwork, bringing in an industrial object, nominating it as an artwork, and thereby destabilizing the field of what fine art can be understood to be. You know, that was 1917, so a long time ago. And since then, we've had so much back and forth between these domains that they've stopped really seeming like they're discrete. And instead we think about why we might find aesthetic pleasure in one side and not another, why our gaze might alight on one object and not another, and realize how very arbitrary and subjective and institutionally constructed that is. Again, some of these are somewhat familiar narratives, but I think that Liz's work and Suh's work in different ways really focus our attention on these questions of what the artist is responsible for, both physically and ethically, and how that relates to different material experiences that layer on top of one another, contest one another, bump up and rub frictionally against one another in ways that make meaning. And the last image I want to show really is motivated by Suh's very moving comments and very poignant work about the COVID pandemic. This is not a work that's related to that. It's rather related to what many have called the other great crisis of 2020, or the other pandemic that we've all been going through, which is of course the pandemic and systematic racism. And so this is a work by Shanique Smith that basically it consists of an anonymous invisible sculpture that's wrapped in these indigo dyed and other cloths, standing in the middle of the foyer of the Baltimore Museum of Art at a time that the Baltimore Museum of Art has been undergoing a very contentious and difficult conversation with itself about deaccessioning works by male white artists so that other demographics, including Black women like Shanique Smith, can be included in the representation of the collection. And so one way that you might understand this work, although it was actually originally devised as a project for a public space outside the museum, but once it's been brought into the galleries, one way that you might understand it as a kind of response to neoclassical sculpture generally, you know, white people and white marble, so frequently, but also the whole idea of a monument or a memorial. And as you all know, these memorials have been being hauled down, often under the aegis of the Black Lives Matter movement, at the very same time that the country has been reeling from COVID. And I realize that a lot of what I'm saying is sort of super familiar 2020 narrative, and now we're in 2021. And we might, in some ways, feel like we might want to move on. But I think at this point, hopefully we're in a position to have a very mature conversation with one another about how to react to these crises, how to move forward positively, and how to even find a kind of beauty even in the trauma that so many people have been experiencing and also pointing to historically. And to me, Shanique Smith here in this work, which is called Grace Stands Beside, very evocative and appropriate title, is doing some things that remind me of what Suh is doing, particularly in her response to the pandemic and the kind of mapping and tracing of all of this loss and pain. And similarly, what Liz is doing in her work is so much like what Stockholder is doing, picking through the detritus and unregarded material culture of our time and bringing it into some kind of formal resolution. And then both Liz and Suh are drawing on these longer trajectories back to traditional textiles, like the examples I started with, or to artists who really opened up the very possibility of a kind of new repertoire for textiles and a new repertoire for sculpture. So that's just a little bit of context for our conversation. Thank you to the anonymous draftsperson who enlivened those images. And also thanks for the technical assist and clearing it up. So maybe Liz and Sue, if you want to unmute and come back on stage with me now, we could have just a short discussion and then open up for questions, if that's all right. Okay, so I guess the first question I wanted to ask you both was really what it was like to work together at a time when you couldn't be together. Because obviously this is, the idea of an artist residency is that you're supposed to kind of hang out and be in the same creative space, but because of social distancing, I gather that wasn't really always possible. So Liz, do you want to start with that and then hear what Sue has to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think in a situation like this, with like a fellowship where you have, like another fellow, I think in January we really expected to be, whining and dining together, and, with critics and with one another, and so it really changed our ability to do that. I mean, we Zoomed together, some. But one of the things that really fascinated me, so even though our work is like super different in a lot of ways and our process is very different, I think the commonalities like kind of fascinated me too, and the way that Sue was gathering fabric, from like the surrounding areas. I mean, I saw some threads of connection that I didn't expect to see, particularly with the sort of distance, that separated us, particularly in this time period. And I think it was a year where it was hard not to have that experience sort of seep into the work in some way. So I think, that was the connection, but certainly it prevented us from having a lot of the normal sort of opportunities to chat freely that one might expect. And I'll let Sue comment.
And so what would you say about that question of being together and apart at the same time?
Personally, I had a two-person show a few times in the past, and then both didn't really work well. So after that, I decided, only solo show. And then it was 2010. And then after that, only solo show. Maybe group show is okay, but no two-person show ever. So when Liz and I were selected as a McKnight Fellowship artist, I was a little bit worried. I will be very honest. How can I work with this artist? Because I've known her work, and then I knew her work and her approach and interest is totally different. But soon we had a stay-at-home kind of order, and then social distancing. We were not able to work together. And then that lasted a couple of months. And then I came to long for the connection with Liz, because I don't really like the forced disconnection. It should be more voluntary basis. So I'm really sorry that we didn't have that kind of a deep connection to work with. Only we had a few days when we work for the installation. But I didn't see her work. I didn't see the new work. And then I wasn't really sure what my new work will be. But finally, we were able to see each other's work, even though we have a totally different way of installation and contact, even though we have some common ground. But I think we work as more organic way. And then I didn't really feel that it is two separate people, two artists show. It's a different, but somewhat I can see the connection. But if we had a little bit more chance and time, I would have invaded her space a little bit more. Maybe I was very polite. I really needed to space, and I never worked with this tiny small gallery ever. And then it was impossible to install two pieces in the tiny space, even sharing the office inside.
Mhm.
So definitely was challenging. And then there are lots of shows outside the group show, but that kind of barrier for my installation, I think that gave me another chance to how to work with another show, another artist's work, or even architectural part. So always I had a very kind of clear, confined, typical gallery space, but this time it was challenging, but at the same time, I was able to work with the space. Some work started outside and then it was installed inside the gallery. So it was more like early kind of treasure hunting kind of feeling too. So
Yeah.
I wish I can invade her space more so that it completely merged together.
Well, it is interesting that you feel that way, because I noticed that to the extent that your work resembles one another at all, because you're obviously very, very different artists, I think that idea of organic growth is definitely a commonality. And I feel like the situation and also the rather kind of complex existing fabric of the center where you were installing, I think that really brought out that aspect of your work particularly so, and I think it's always sort of been there for you, Liz, anyway. But I definitely see like at least some meeting, not necessarily in the middle, but some kind of inclining, like magnets pulling towards each other a little bit there. The second question I wanted to ask you both, and maybe I'll start with you, so is a question about place. I was very interested in the fact that you both seem to be configuring space, or place, I should say, as absence. And I think it's more obvious in your work, so because you're actually literally making maps, like in the vicinity of the funeral homes, by cutting out holes, and you're obviously speaking about loss. So there's a very specific transcription of mapping as removal in your work. But then, Liz, I was really interested in the idea that you were using dislocation, which of course is the other side of the found object, because the found object has always been dislocated from somewhere, right? So it always implies dislocation. But it seemed to me like you're using dislocation almost as an expressive force in the work, and particularly thinking about where you live and your complex feelings about where you live, and all of our complex feelings about urban rural divides, blah blah blah, red state, blue state, fill in the end of the sentence as you like. But I feel like there's some way in which place as like a hole in the heart or something like that might be relevant to your work, as well as what Suh's doing in a more explicit way. So can I ask you first to talk a little bit about that mapping idea and why you thought or how you thought of the idea of mapping initially as a kind of process of subtraction?
So I think my shelter piece and then falling walls, I have a little bit different ideas and approach regarding the mapping and geographical information. Always I was really fascinated with the place. Maybe one day I asked why I'm really obsessed with a place. Maybe my kind of status, my floating status, because definitely I left my home country, even though I created a second life in USA. Still always I'm asking whether I have a deep roots in this Minnesota. So maybe they kind of long for my kind of heritage, my tradition, my family, that makes me kind of investigate kind of the places. So that's why my focus was in diaspora experience for a long time. But in terms of shelter, I really wanted to more larger kind of geographical information kind of embedded into a fabric. When I started collecting the discarded material was how to break the imbalance between the city and countryside. And then one of the famous economists said the most of modern problem and diseases came from the imbalance between the city and the rural small towns. So I was completely agreeing with his statement. So I think that's very true in art. So I want you to kind of make a list like 20 small towns, kind of in wide range of population and geographical distance from the main metro area. So because art scene is mostly kind of focusing on the big city, because I used to live in Duluth for a long time, I kind of see that kind of barrier all the time. So we cannot really have a really big shows in small cities, even Duluth that often. But what if I kind of use the ideas and traditions from local or small cities and then bring them back to my own artwork? And then maybe that piece can be traveling. So that was kind of my initial thought. But as I mentioned in the power presentation, I kind of reinterpreted that project. So I used that kind of fabric, that kind of the vehicle that containing the personal or family histories, and then use as a more kind of the shelter and then the way we lived last year.
Okay, thank you. Liz, would you like to say something about this concept of place?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I kind of think about it, I guess part of my understanding of like where I live has been shaped, and I think Suh touched on this, by other people's perceptions of where I live, you know, and sort of rural America. I mean, I think it's something that we hear a lot in the news, in the sort of divisive politics that we're in. You know, we hear a lot about the urban-rural divide, and I also, you know, during the last, like, you know, not only the last year, but I'd say like the last 8 years, you know, I've experienced other people's sort of like a nostalgia for the rural, like they're sort of like, oh, well, you know, it's this negative place, but like it's really beautiful or it's really peaceful. And I think that for me, I found that it was harder for me to sort of like forgive the negative things than it was for like a lot of people that would, you know, sort of like come to the country for the weekend and like write an article, you know, and so I think that in a sense, like I don't know that I knew it at the time, but I think there's like, I was almost like looking for something poetic and something nostalgic, these kind of like moments that I could like sort of attach to. So like these like little moments of like, you know, both sort of mundane materials inserted in the landscape, but these little moments of care in the landscape were really beautiful and poetic to me, and embodied so much more of the kind of like personal tension that I feel in the landscape than some of the more obvious gestures. Because I also, to be clear, you know, I don't want to skirt around the issue that I did see a lot of other things as I was exploring the landscape that, you know, were more overt. Like, you know, at some point I saw like a huge Trump flag that had blown off a barn and was just kind of, you know, laying in the landscape. And I was like, should I like grab that and, you know, like start, but I sort of was really interested in like trying to find this other poetic sensibility in the landscape through these kind of just discarded moments, or, you know, these more subtle moments. And that's just somehow what I kind of latched onto.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe I'll just ask one last question, if that's okay, and we can take questions from the audience then. I just wanted to ask you both quickly about textiles, because that's sort of the topic at hand. And, you know, one thing I didn't say, but maybe was implicit in my comments, is that, you know, if you're thinking about the made versus the found, or the industrial versus the hand, textiles was not just any material, because of course textiles were the material that drove the Industrial Revolution in the first place. And then everything else that was connected with the Industrial Revolution, like the slave industry of, you know, the slave economy rather, of the southern United States that fed the cotton mills of England that were mechanized. And so when we think about textile and we think about an opposition between hand and machine, let's say, we're thinking about a very particular history that has had a lot of consequence. So that's like the deep background. But I wonder for you today, now that we're in 2021 and textiles is no longer, generally speaking, a very expensive thing. Mechanization has made it into such a commonplace materiality, the colors and textures and patterns that would have been so expensive at any time in history up until the 19th century are now extremely cheap. So it's really changed for our generation and preceding ones. And I wonder how you both feel about working with the medium today. I realize you're working with textiles in combination with lots of other materials, but I think that might make your perspective on it even more interesting. So Liz, maybe you could start, and then so you could finish up, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So Liz, textiles, what do you think?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question for me. I have like a academic background in painting. So I came to textiles in sort of a roundabout way through collage that was first flat. And then I started sort of admiring fashion and the history of dress, and sort of came at textiles in that way, because I realized that they had the potential to be sculptural and flat, and that they were both really strong and really malleable at the same time. Gradually my work sort of like evolved so that like a lot of the other materials I was using were eliminated, and I was focusing more specifically on these kind of textile materials. And I think I've given a lot of thought to how I do relate to some of the histories, that are associated with textiles, but how I also really don't have like a lot of the sort of like formal skills of traditional textile artists. And so I'm like creating these kind of improvised ways of working with these materials. And I'm really fascinated by like the history of textiles in relation to like industry. Like I used to be using a lot of stiffened felt and found out it was used for sound dampening. And so I would kind of have these conversations, in like automobiles and all these other equipment. I would have these conversations with like the companies that I was buying these materials from. And so it really led me to kind of think about textiles and their application in a super broad sense. But I'm really also interested in the sort of history of how textiles do embody the voices of, many marginalized communities. So like I really like the catalog for the show at the ICA. I think it's like less is a bore, or it's a maximalist, sort of catalog, and the accompanying writing is about that. And I have a maximalist sort of aesthetic in my work that I think has a lot of like historical counterparts in the textile community, even if I'm not using necessarily the same sort of established vocabularies of making.
Okay, so for you, it sounds like textiles is as much a representational medium or symbolic medium as something that you're working with in a sort of traditional hand construction way, but interested in all different avenues through the medium. So do you have any last things to say about textiles before we open it up for questions?
I wish I have a very grand kind of answer for that. I mean, the textile and fabrics are now so favored kind of medium by many contemporary artists. Some artists use kind of a woven jute, the sack to use as a more kind of symbol of global trade and the evidence of precarious labor. And then the artist that you showed, Smith, her work, she didn't use any traditional technique, kneading, sewing, but she just made kind of a mess of a fabric, kind of bundles to talk about the global the trade and also feminist kind of labor discourse. And then another artist used a fabric as to address a kind of genocide of her own country she experienced. So I wish I can kind of share what is my kind of connotation of a fabric. But I think if I kind of look back why I started working with fabric, I think it was a very practical reason, to be honest. My background was in metalsmithing, and then I needed some kind of different medium that I can work at home, having my own child. So for me, the skin is something that you wear daily. as I was trained metalsmithing and jewelry as a kind of wearable object, decorative work, beautify your body. So it was kind of a natural kind of shift, kind of same kind of functionality, but different medium that I can access. But I was soon amazed by the quality of textile provided me, that kind of more malleable, but at the same time, as Liz mentioned, it has so much structure. Maybe that's why I started with silk organza, which is almost kind of kind of in between essence and presence, kind of semi-transparent quality. So, but depending on how you fabricate, it gives you such a strong structure. So most of my box, it is vessel forms, three-dimensional vessel forms out of silk organza. People ask me what I did. Did you use a stitch or did you insert some kind of internal structure? But actually, I use a fabric only, but I was able to make the three-dimensional fabric, which is so resilient. At the same time, I can contain inside. I was inspired by the bojagi because that was kind of mainly Korean wrapper in traditional sense. So I was able to contain not something tangible, but abstract. And it was portable at the same time. So that's why I've been kind of I started textile work. And then it has been a little bit shifted a little bit, but still I'm really fascinated by the quality. But lately I'm exploring more kind of textile anatomy, because previously I was really obsessed with controlling, making three-dimensional form, boxes and pyramid. But I think my falling rose is the first piece that I just let what textile can do in interaction to the gravity. So it was very first kind of loosely hanging piece.
Okay. Well, thank you. You brought up a sort of new topic there, which is the relationship between textiles and abstraction. And it's often been observed, especially recently in art history, that textile artists in so many different cultures were doing abstraction long before Kandinsky and Mondrian thought of it, which is a fair point and maybe a good one to end on. It's also just really nice to see so many people out there. I realize not everybody has their camera on, but a lot of the folks that do are making something with their hands right now as they're listening to us in textiles, which is really great to see. Keep it up, guys. So Tracy and team, do you want to lead us through Q&A? I see we have some in the chat box already that we can address.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the question. I'm going to actually contribute a little to the question. This conversation about textiles and materiality and even talking about some of the inherent qualities of particular materials, kind of going off of that. One of the questions is, I would love to hear more from the artists speaking to the gendered elements of their work, as in how they are thinking about gender interacting with and are mapping onto the themes of their work, material choices and processes as another layer of concerns that are sort of bubbling to the surface in the past year. And I'm going to also say, as someone who's been in the field for a long time, I think those questions have been bubbling to the surface for decades. So however you guys want to respond to any or all of that.
I mean, I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm always careful, so I use a lot of bright colors in my work, and whether I use like textile materials or other materials, you know, a lot of times I'll have people say that the color is like feminine, and then I think when you add like a layer of sort of like handiwork, I mean, none of the stuff I'm doing is like very skilled in terms of weaving paracord in and out of gutter guards. I mean, it's definitely not like fine sort of sewing, but I mean, I do think that, like, in particular, I guess I'll just focus on the work that I have up at the Textile Center, that there is a pairing of banal industrial hardware, mass-produced materials with a sort of slow attention to weaving materials through those things that has a relationship, I think, to, you know, elements of craft, elements of handiwork, things often done on like a smaller, more intimate scale, that throughout history, you know, often are associated with sort of like an idea of like women's work. But I really am cautious about saying that, because I also think it's like the lens that you look at those things through, and a lot of making has been sort of written out of history. And so I think that there are like a lot of people that are not, you know, women that are doing that work throughout history, you know, other cultures as well, and that it's just not as seen, I guess. And so, but I'm really interested, definitely. I've always been interested in just dichotomies, like hard and soft materials, domestic versus industrial. I mean, those type of like tensions or oppositions fascinate me. And so those are certainly, you know, intentional in my work. I'll let comment.
I'm really sorry, Tracy. I was reading the chat. Can you, while you are introducing the questions, can you say it again?
Well, yeah, we're talking about materiality, and a participant had a question asking if you would speak about the gendered elements in your work in terms of how you think about gender interacting with and or mapping onto the themes of your work, material choices, processes.
The for shelter piece, I use kind of a second-handed material from garage sales and the cardboard. And for recent years, I've been experimenting with the digital fabrication. That was kind of something new. In the past, I used to kind of sew pretty much every single my work, but lately I've been investigating the new possibility of a digital fabrication. So I started the fabric and then after kind of cardboard, I was going to use the shipping boxes that I consumed last year, because last year we were all stayed inside, and then all the kind of economic activity was through pretty much Amazon. So I had a lot of Amazon shipping boxes. So I was going to use those materials to really integrate with the second-handed fabrics. But that didn't work, so I had to use kind of a new shipping cardboard. So that was kind of sometimes in terms of material, it is through my concept, or sometimes through new investigation with a new technology. So I think the way I work is not just only one linear way, very consistent. Sometimes I try many different things, and then eventually it kind of gathered in a one piece. And then the silk organza is kind of my long loved kind of material. But this time, as I mentioned briefly, I just let it kind of create their own shape by its own quality. So I didn't really use any kind of my manual fabrication. Basically, I hang from the ceiling. And then by removing some portion, it was kind of a void representing maybe the depth, so that I matched the number of cutouts with the number of depth from each county. But as a whole, I wanted to symbolize that maybe the fabric is not merely just only mapping or geographical information, but also it is a fabric of our society. because I think those numbers could have been prevented. We didn't have to have that many kind of losses if we had a better system. So that kind of void symbolizes that, but at the same time, all the flaws that our system kind of revealed. So that was kind of my approach to this kind of very thin sheer like fabric for this project.
So playing off of that question, it's amazing the breadth of, I don't know if I want to use the word representation or what you might call it, that using textile materials has in the field. This question was addressed for Glenn, but I think it's something you can all comment. I'd love it if Glenn would start. Why do you think textiles are becoming such a popular medium in contemporary art? I mean, they just seem to sort of be ubiquitous, whether it's the materials or the process, or even just ideas about textiles as a vocabulary, a history, or a sensibility. If you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. It's very striking to me as well, as you might imagine, since I've been working on craft history for almost 30 years now, and when I started that wasn't the case. And the first version of the phenomenon that you're describing occurred with ceramics, and then fiber seemed to be very swiftly following in its wake in such a way as to make figures like Lenore Tawney or Sheila Hicks suddenly seem newly relevant, and these kind of unacknowledged precursors for so much of what's going on in the contemporary. So the big question obviously is why? And we could talk about that probably all day, but just to throw out a couple of ideas. One is that, and this is maybe the obvious place to start, is that it seems like the opposite of the digital, despite the fact that, as we all know, digital technology has its origins in jacquard looms. Everybody knows that story. And as we talked about, the digital in terms of hands and the digital in terms of technology, there's a kind of interweaving there. But in terms of 21st century experience, I think the very strong sense of connection and realness that you get when you're sitting at the loom or knitting or crocheting or engaging in one of these other practices, or indeed making ceramics, just has a kind of tactility, a palpable quality that seems very absent when we're dealing with our screens. So it's a kind of antidote. But clearly there's a lot more going on than that. And I think a lot of it to me has to do with a related issue, which is that artists want to demonstrate value in their work at a time when materiality itself seems to be kind of cheapened, you could say. Obviously, it's a period that where a lot of artists are, particularly well-capitalized artists, are using fabricators to make their work. So there's this sort of like Donald Judd send off the memo and have the work come back kind of dynamic that's become very general in the art world. It's what I wrote about with Julia Bryan Wilson in our book Art in the Making. And that's produced itself a contrary reaction, sort of like the digital has produced a contrary reaction, where artists want to demonstrate that they do have skill, that they are engaging with specific material histories, that they can find meaning in process, and it's not just a kind of bare abstraction or conceptualism. It's almost as if there's a kind of earnestness or proof of intent or dedication that comes in the craft medium. And that last thing I'll say is that you can also see that, interestingly, when it comes to protest culture, of which the so-called pink pussy hat would be the most obvious example. It's like, there's a big difference between going to the streets with a mass-produced sign as opposed to going to the streets with something that you've actually made yourself, because it's almost like you're saying, no, I really mean this because I sat up all night, and knitted this thing, and I'm putting it on my head and I'm going to go out and shout. And I think there's just, in so many ways, we seem to live in a culture that's starved of authenticity. And you see it in our politics, you see it in our media culture, and really starved for a kind of depth experience. There's just so much kind of efficacious superficiality around. And I think that textiles and ceramics, of all the crafts, are probably the ones that offer themselves in the most available way to artists who do something against that. You know, frankly, they're just a lot easier and a lot cheaper to deal with than glass and metal and woodworking, right? Because to even get started in any of those three crafts, you need to have a lot of experience and a lot of equipment. Whereas textiles and ceramics, it's like, you know, in ceramics, all you really need is a kiln. Textiles, you don't even need that. So it's really like an open door to try to have those experiences of authenticity and depth and tactility that seem so gravely missing elsewhere in the culture. So that's what I would say.
Liz or Eun-Kyung, do you want to comment on that, on the use of textiles, or why you think textiles have become such a popular medium? I think another question that's relevant to that is how do you see the aesthetic quality of textiles evolving? And I want to say, I think it's an interesting thing to say that process is now sort of process as authentic, process is a viable conceptual basis for work. I mean, I think that's been a long struggle over the last 20 years, you know, having come up through the field of textiles, teaching and making myself, having that conversation about how process and material are just as important as some sort of external conceptual basis for the work has been a really interesting conversation over the last couple decades. Don't want to get off topic, but any other thoughts that either of the fellows have about what textiles mean to their practice?
I mean,
Go
go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess I was just going to say, so like, to me, oftentimes I completely love and agree with what Glenn said about like a sort of like, well, I don't know, reaction against might be too strong a statement, but you know, whether it's like, sort of intentional or not. I mean, I think the sort of tactile quality of like textiles is super attractive in a Zoom culture, you know, in a kind of Zoom world. But I would also say that like my foray into textiles, like the stiffened felt that I started using a long time ago and have sort of abandoned recently, but it was sort of like the Twinkies of the textile world. Like it wasn't nice kind of like felt, you know, it was just like this really cheap kind of industrial material that could take a beating. And I'm always like excited about those type of materials. And I'm finding like the sort of textiles that I'm using, like the paracord, the rope, like all of it is, well, the majority of it is for these kind of industrial applications or sporting applications or these other sorts of applications. And I do think that even though some of the hand making is a reaction against sort of digital culture, I also think that we just live in a world where it's so easy to sort of use the internet to find materials, you know, that you didn't even know existed, and to find ways to kind of like feed those into your practice. And so I guess that's the only thing I would say, you know, that maybe is a little bit different perspective in terms of how I use textiles and how I engage with the material.
Yeah, maybe I could just add to that, just to say that I think that's super interesting, the fact that materiality gets opened up by the digital as well as challenged by it. And of course, not necessarily in an art gallery context like what you guys are doing, but if you think about the current, well, I would describe it as a craft revival, really, a huge kind of vitality, and not just during COVID, you know, when obviously people are turning to it for all sorts of reasons, but even before the pandemic started, it's pretty clear that digital circulation, distribution, and sales platforms, most obviously Etsy, but far beyond that, have made, and actually maybe Instagram more effectively in recent years, have made craft businesses a much more viable proposition, which is really interesting because it suggests that on the one hand, craft is almost like a reaction against the digital. On the other hand, is being supercharged by the digital and using it as one of its toolkits. Very interesting, complex situation. Fascinating. And I would definitely see Liz's work in particular as being like an aesthetic response to that sort of set of relationships, and sort of the internal chaos of it in some ways seems to mirror those you know, tensions and affinities.
I mean, even though I can say I'm kind of fiber or textile artist, recently I was so surprised to see the wide range or scope of contemporary art using the textile. It was amazing to see their work globally, not only limited to USA. And then I think last year it was kind of the time that I rediscovered the value of the textile. And then I was not able to start the project until like September, but almost for a year-long isolation, I needed to some kind of manual activity rather than conceptual or intellectual kind of activities, more repetitive or soothing, something that is small and maybe it is meaningless kind of activity like knitting or I'm not saying knitting is meaningless, but I needed some kind of repetitive action because I think everybody experienced that kind of pandemic plus the racial discrimination and hate crimes on targeting on Asian people, and then surge of far-right group. All the issues, it was unbearable personally. So I barely survived. So during that long isolation, that kind of repetitive work, working with the fiber or textile, that's what happened to me. I think that's happening to everyone here or to many people. People were not able to go to museums or galleries, but they kept knitting, crocheting, or quilting. So I really realized the power of fiber or beyond craft. So I strongly believed the craft was omnipresent, the fiber, and then fiber, in a broad sense, the craft has a so strong healing kind of property. So yeah, I want to kind of interpret what the fiber can do for upcoming years after post-pandemic. So it was such a valuable time and experience, kind of evaluating the power that fiber can do.
I am going to say that I think we're going to conclude with that because we're at 2:30, which is right about where we thought we're going to stop. I think your last comment there, Sue, you said the power of what fiber can do. That's like, can't go out on a better note. I want to thank you all for participating. I want to thank all of the participants for joining the session, but particularly Glenn, thank you so much for your gift of time and brilliance over the last few months working with the fellows. It has been a gift for me to be able to listen in on the conversations. Also to Eun-Kyung and to Liz, of course, and we are really looking forward to the day when the three of us and hopefully more can actually get together and have the celebratory and whatever that we had been hoping for over the last year. Again, I just want to remind everybody on Monday, the 8th, we'll be having another conversation with Karen Patterson from the fabric workshop in the evening at 6 o'clock. We are recording this conversation and we'll probably give it another listen and get it up onto our website as part of the McKnight Fellowships for Fiber Artists archive so that folks who weren't able to join us today can feel like they've participated. So with that said, I guess I should say any last words that any of the three conversationists want to have?
just want to congratulate Suh and Liz on their work. It's been a great pleasure to engage with you both, and sensational outcome. So just wishing you all the best in your future endeavors.
And I just want to say thank you again so much for being part of this conversation and the conversations leading up to it. It's been really awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope one of you here today could present in next years in the future. I will be listening.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.